Hey guys, Retro Game Club here with another tutorial for you. You may have seen our last tutorial which covered every single setting in the Emulation Station and RetroEvolved or RetroPie setup script, and that gives you a really great foundation of all the basics, but it did not cover anything about games, namely RetroArch. So since these consoles, all RetroPie and RetroEvolved consoles use RetroArch for the majority of their emulators to control things like graphic enhancements, live saving, loading, adding overlays and bezels and all kinds of cool stuff. We're going to go over that today. So there's a very easy way to edit all of the settings per console to change things like bezels and shaders, and that's what I recommend doing. If you want, of course you can edit your system in a way where every single console has the same settings. This is not recommended in my opinion, but I'm going to show you how to do that first in case you want to save yourself some time and, you know, just get a basic configuration done to begin with. So the way that we do that is we go up to our configuration editor, which is found in your RetroEvolved settings menu or your RetroPie settings menu. Go into the configuration editor. We're going to need a keyboard plugged in, most likely, and you're going to go to configure basic libretro emulator options at the very top, and then we're going to choose configure default options for all libretro emulators. So these are just a very small selection of settings that you can change, and they will affect every single console that you have. So you got to be very careful because you can break something or, you know, make some undesirable changes if you're not careful. Some safe things you can do, however, are to do a shader. If you wanted to do a shader for every single console, that's okay. It may not look good on every single one, so you may have to change it, but it might look good on the majority of them. So let me explain what these settings do. Video smoothing uses bilinear filtering, which is a very common way of smoothing out the edges and pixelation on games. You can enable this if you're not going to use pixel shaders, or if you're not going to use any specific kind of shader that this would influence. In our instance, we're going to be using the CRT shaders, which come pre-installed with RetroEvolved and RetroPie consoles, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. For the aspect ratio, this is how you can configure your games for wide screens, for 4:3 if you have a old CRT screen, stuff like that. You can change the aspect ratio of each game. Render resolution sets the resolution that the games will be outputted at. However, if you choose a lower resolution, it can help enhance the performance of the game, and the hardware will just upscale it. So you have to consider, yes, you can raise these resolutions to get better looking picture, but it will cost your performance. Video shader enable. You want to turn this on if you want to do things like graphical enhancements such as the CRT filters, if you wanted to use the 2x upscaling kind of filters. There's many different filters that come pre-installed in the video shader folder that you can go through. I've tried most of these, and to be honest, many of them are either hideous or impact the performance of the game significantly, which is really unfortunate. It's just the nature of the hardware, to be honest. The ones that are really safe to use and give you a really cool CRT look, although they're not as customizable as you may like, which you can change if you want to get into the advanced tutorial. We're going to keep it basic today though, is the CRT filters. So the ones that I recommend is the CRT Pie Curvature or CRT Pie. The curvature one simulates the curved corners of the screen for a actual CRT television, so it makes a kind of curved slightly, very slight distortion to the screen, which is desirable because all these games were actually designed for those screens, so oftentimes games will look better with that slight distortion, and especially the CRT filter itself. Now, I'm not going to activate this because I've configured all of my systems on a system basis rather than editing the global configuration here. So keep in mind, if you want to enable video shaders, just go to Video Shader Enable and select True. And then you have to select the file, the video shader file you want to use. To test these out live, you have to be in an actual game, so this may not be very useful for your first foray into RetroArch, but at least tells you what this stuff means, and if you decide you like a particular filter, you can come back here and you can make that the filter for all of your consoles, should you choose. Overlay Enable, you can set to True if you plan on using things like bezels or fake game pads, things like that. A bezel takes up the sides and sometimes top of the screen to give you an additional effect, like maybe you're playing it on an actual CRT television and it'll have like the knobs for the CRT drawn on the side of the screen to really, you know, give you that immersive feeling, or it could just be some really cool artwork, things like that. We'll show you that later. And then overlay file is where you choose the actual overlay. Choose joypad order. We've already gone over in a previous tutorial. You probably won't be changing any of that. And of course these same settings can be done per system here, but I'm going to show you a cooler way to do it now. So the easiest way to configure these sort of shaders and things like that in RetroArch is to open up a console that you want to play. So let's choose Game Boy, for example, and let's pick some game that we're familiar with what it's supposed to look like. You know, something that we may have played before and we're familiar with, because you do want a good starting point. You don't want to choose a game you've never played. And we're gonna go ahead and just start with Super Mario Land on the Game Boy, and I'm gonna show you what kind of settings we can change here. So this is my default setting, which has a fake little Game Boy on the edge of the screen to give it that cool effect, and then the screen is slightly green, and as you notice it does have some CRT scan lines on it, which it doesn't look super great when you're showing it, when you're recording the screen like I am. It looks better in person, so you'll want to try it out yourself. But the way to do that is, once you're in a game, go ahead and hold select and hit the X button, or whatever you have mapped to the X button. So for me, I'm holding select, I'm hitting this button here. That opens up the RetroArch menu. From here, it is a breeze to change all the settings that affect your system for every emulator. And it's also easy to change things on a per console basis, which is what I recommend. So if you want to change some stuff, obviously you don't want to have the Game Boy Color bezel pop up when you're playing PlayStation games, stuff like that. So let me show you quickly how to go into that, since those are some of the most popular features. So to change the overlay, you go into Settings, and you go down here to On-Screen Display. And then we have On-Screen Overlay. You're going to select that, you're going to choose Display Overlay, set that to On, and then I would choose Hide Overlay in Menu, set it to Off. Okay, because we want to be able to see what our overlay looks like while we're editing it. Show Inputs on Overlay is unnecessary, you can leave that off. And then basically what we're going to do is we're going to go into the Overlay Preset folder here, and we're going to choose what kind of overlay we want to use. So everyone has different overlays. The ones that I'm going to be showing you today do not come pre-installed on RetroPie consoles, but they do come pre-installed on RetroEvolved consoles. So if you have downloaded our non-commercial RetroEvolved image, you will have these overlays. They can't be included in systems that you intend to sell, because many of these overlays are copyrighted and have non-commercial licenses, but you can distribute them with an image for free as long as you're paying attention to the license, okay? So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we have disabled hide overlay in menu. We want that off so that we can actually see the overlay we're working with as we change its opacity and scale. If you have a RetroEvolved console, we can go into the overlay preset folder and we can find all of these custom overlays. For everyone else, these exact overlays may not be applicable to you, but you can still go into this overlay preset folder and you can choose anything that's there. You can also install third-party overlays that you've downloaded off the internet. Pretty easy to find. Just do a YouTube search for how to install Bezels on RetroPie or RetroEvolved, and you'll find what you're looking for. So we're going to go into the overlay preset folder. We're going to go down to handhelds, and we're going to go down to Game Boy Color in this instance. So since this is a handheld console, I really like the idea of being able to see some of the logos, the buttons, things like that. Not everybody's into that, and there's many other bezels you can use, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to show you this one. So we're going to choose Nintendo Game Boy Color Alt, and it's going to put that overlay around the edge of the screen. You can then choose the overlay opacity, and all that is basically the transparency of the overlay. So if you think that it's too bright, for instance, you can lower the opacity so that it's not quite as bright, or if you really want it to shine in really clear, you can raise that. As far as the overlay scale goes, that determines the size of the overlay. So this is really important for lining it up with the window, and you really don't want to cut off too much of the screen. You want to be careful, because on the original Game Boy you did get to see all four corners of the screen. So I know it's not perfect, and no overlay really is, and you will perhaps get some little teeny black bars around the edge. If you want to cut them off and sacrifice some of the viewable screen, you can just lower the scale a little bit more, and that will push it in, but for me, I leave it at 1.07. Show inputs on overlay is irrelevant. You can leave that off, and listen port, you can leave that off as well. This is for things like touch screens and iPads and stuff like that, which we're not playing on right now. And that's it. So for each console, you can do this. And what you want to do to save this for a particular console, or let's say you had a particular game that you wanted to have one shader but all games have another shader, there's a way to save them differently that I'm going to show you now. If you were to exit the game right now, this would not be saved. So make sure that you go back by pressing B until you get to the quick menu option. Go to the quick menu option and scroll to the very bottom where it says Save Core Overrides and Save Game Overrides. If you want to save this particular bezel and shader and everything that you've done so far only for this game, then choose Save Game Overrides. This is helpful for certain games that may be in different orientations, like vertical, things like that. If you think that this is a good setting, you're comfortable with it, and you're ready to use that for your entire console, then go ahead and save core overrides. And that's what we're going to do now. When you save it, you'll get a little notification message, and you'll know that that is permanently saved as the override for this console now. Next we have shaders. Shaders will undoubtedly be one of your favorite features of RetroEvolved and RetroPie consoles, because it lets you make your games look however you want them to look. It can be a little bit complex though, and overwhelming if you haven't ever messed with it before, so I'm going to give you a basic rundown of how this works. When you first open the shaders menu for any given console, it's probably going to look like this. The first thing that you want to do to add a shader is go to the shader passes area and select 1. This means that we are going to do one shader for this console. Then you go to shader number 0. What this means is that's basically the first shader that we're going to do, and in this instance we only have one shader. If you press A, or your select button, on this option, it's going to take you into this menu where you can then choose your shaders from the stock shaders folder. So I would go down to shaders, select it, And here are all of the shaders that come pre-installed with RetroEvolved and RetroPie consoles. To be honest, I've checked out most of these personally. I've tried almost every single one of them, and many of them have undesirable effects, such as slowing the game down or making the image look a little too distorted. You can feel free to experiment with all of them. Everyone has different tastes, but I'll tell you, for the sake of this video, for almost every single emulator, the most safe option you can do, aside from installing a manual shader from scratch that you've downloaded, is to use the CRT Pi options that are pre-installed. These have very little impact on performance, and they have a really great effect on most consoles. Notably, I use them for almost every single console other than portables like the Game Gear and systems like N64, where some games just do not look good with it. Keep in mind, we can edit when these shaders are used so that each game can have its own separate shader. So if there is a game that does not look good with the CRT shader, you can disable it just for that game and have all the other games continue using it. So first we just select whatever shader we want, which I recommend CRT Pi Curvature, which adds a slight distortion to the screen to make it look as if your screen is curved. And then we will use the filter option here. This will change based off personal taste. I usually leave it on Don't Care for both filter and scale. What we'll do is we'll apply the changes, and then we'll exit the menu and we'll look at our game and we'll say, do we like the way that it looks? You know? And if we don't like the way that it looks, go ahead and open it back up and go down here and change the filter. See, maybe we like the linear filter better. Be sure that you don't just change it to linear, but hit apply changes so that we can actually see the effect change. Then press select and X again to enter the game. Look at your changes, and if they look good to you, then you can just save it. If not, make further changes by changing the scale and linear filter until you achieve the desired effect, and then hit apply changes. Now here's where the important part comes in. Now we've decided I have a good look for my game. Do I want to save this look for all games from that console? Or do I just want to save it for this particular game? When you save core preset, it's going to save a preset for the entire console that has these settings. If you save a game preset, then that's just going to be something that you can use for each individual game. Now this won't immediately remap any of the files. This is actually just a preset, which can be chosen from the Load Shader Preset menu. To change the settings for the entire core or the game, you would then go back to the quick menu, go to the bottom where it says Save Core Overrides or Save Game Overrides. This is where you will actually save this shader that you've made permanently onto either the entire console for every game or just this game. So be careful which option you choose. In this example, we're going to choose Save Core Overrides because we've made a setting that we like for all of the games on this console. Quick menu. The quick menu is where most of the key important features for RetroArch are going to be found. So at the top, you can resume your game, you can restart your game, you can close the game, you can take an image screenshot, which will be stored in a folder on the console. You can change save state slots. You can imagine this kind of like old games where you choose, hey, you want to save an A, B, C, D, etc. Your save state area is where you can load and save games on the fly at any moment, anytime. So if you want to save a game, you can save it into one of these slots, and then later you can load it from these slots. There's two ways of doing this. The first is by using your hotkey enable button and pressing X to open up the menu, going to quick menu, and then going to save state. This will save your game in whatever slot has been selected by state slot. Then when you go to load your game, you can do the same exact thing except hit load state, and it will load the game from whatever state slot you have chosen. You can think of this kind of like the old games that used memory cards and you had to choose a save file for your game. It's the same concept, except it's stored either on your hard drive or your micro SD card, depending on your configuration. The second way of saving in RetroArch is to use a hotkey. This is the more preferable method, since when you're saving you may not want to enter in a menu and start navigating options. So you can use your hotkey enable button, and you can press the first trigger button or the shoulder button. This will save the state. Then when you want to load your state, you can hold your hotkey enable button and hit the left shoulder button, and this will load your state. If you're having trouble seeing it say save and load at the bottom of the screen in yellow font, you can adjust the size of the font so that you can more clearly see when you have saved and when you have loaded the game. To do this, you go to the main menu, you scroll down to settings, and you go to on-screen display. In on-screen display, there's an area called notifications. In notifications, you can change the size of the font, which a good size for it is 20 if you'd like bigger font. And then you can also change the location that the font shows up, which by default is at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. A quick method that I use to get it into the middle of the screen where it's a little bit more visible is to change the X position to 0.17 and change the Y position to 0.09. This will move the text so that when you save a game and load a game, the text will appear more towards the middle of the screen. It will not show up larger until you restart RetroArch. So you'll need to exit the game and load the game again to be able to see the change in the text size, which you'll now see at the bottom. Whenever you start a game, it'll tell you what controller you've loaded and it'll appear there. So you can adjust this however you want to make it go towards the middle of the screen, especially if you're using overlays. It's not always super attractive to have it halfway over here and halfway in the middle, so it's up to you to configure that. So let's go back into the main menu by pressing the select and the X button, go to quick menu, and we'll resume where we left off now that you know how to save and load on the fly. You can undo your load state if you accidentally loaded somewhere you didn't want to. You can undo your last save, and that's basically it as far as saving and loading goes. You can change where the games get saved in the configuration file, but this is a little bit more advanced, and I have covered it in another tutorial, so check that out on retrogame.club or on our YouTube channel. The next thing that you can do is you can add games to favorites. I do not believe that this translates over to Emulation Station, so I probably would just avoid that option and stick to Emulation Station favorites. There's also an options menu which will appear on certain emulators, but for the Atari emulator that we're on right now, there are no additional options. You can also go into the controls area where you can change what type of controller is hooked up. So if you have a RetroPad or if you have a PlayStation controller, many of these controllers have analog sticks, and you can choose the analog option if your controller has one that you'd rather the analog be the default way of moving. You can do this for each controller, and you can also load configurations from this menu. However, keep in mind, this isn't the ideal way of doing it, since we are using Emulation Station to control our controller configurations. So it's better to change your controller config in Emulation Station than it is to go in here and manually edit it. So I would only do this as a last resort. Then you can save the core remap file, which says I want these controls to be this way for every single game on whatever console that I'm running. And for game remap, this is saying I want to save a specific controller configuration, but only for this one game. Then you can go here and you can change every single button manually. So if you have an issue with one of your games where the controls aren't right, but just for one game, or maybe just for one console you don't like the controller layout, you can edit it here without fear of it impacting the rest of your consoles. So moving down the list, you can choose Load Core, which is going to be unnecessary for us because all of our emulator loading will be taking place in Emulation Station. This is actually a setting that you would use only if you are using RetroArch standalone as its own program. So you can pretty much ignore Load Core, Load Content, Load Recent, Scan Content, NetPlay. You can ignore most of those. You can try using NetPlay from here if you want to play a particular game online with another person, but there's a better way of doing it, which is choosing NetPlay from the RetroEvolved or RetroPie settings menu and choosing NetPlay. Then we have the settings menu. This is where you can find the on-screen bezels that we were talking about earlier, and we have many other features such as drivers, video, audio, input, and etc. For drivers, we're probably going to leave all of these the same, except if you look up a particular configuration for a game that you want to implement, because that game may not work perfectly with RetroArch. Here is where you would go to change some of the drivers to experiment and see maybe if I change some of these settings, this particular game will work better. The default drivers are listed on the screen now, so if you ever mess up and you need to go back to default, these are the default settings. We're not going to go over what all of these drivers do because that's more of an advanced topic, but now you know where you can go to change many of the drivers for the RetroArch console settings. Then we have video. Video is an area you will go once in a while, again, to help with performance for particular games. It's not something you would want to change for the whole console most of the time, although here is where you can go to change many of the settings, such as the scale of the window, which can be lowered to increase performance, the aspect ratio, which is controlled in many other places, so you will probably ignore it here, custom aspect ratio, integer scale, which is a method of making the screen appear smaller by using integers to scale the window. This is a good technique if you have a portable console where you don't want it stretched to fill the whole screen and want it to be a little bit smaller so that it looks higher resolution. Then we have threaded video, which I suggest always leaving on. It means that the processor is using multiple threads to emulate this game, so it's giving it the full performance that it has. We have vertical sync, which often makes no difference and can be disabled for a very small performance upgrade if your system needs it. Then we have many advanced settings we're not going to cover here, such as GPU sync. Black frame insertion is usually noticeable unless you have a very high resolution screen. When you turn it on, my camera may not be showing it, but there is a visible flickering effect that it puts onto the screen. And this is useful because it drops the frame rate of each game in half, but it's also quite unappealing if you don't have a television that can handle it. Then we have crop overscan, which is an effect to get rid of the black bars on screens, which can be edited elsewhere, and I recommend editing it not in this menu, but elsewhere. Then you have bilinear filtering, which will help to smooth out the pixels on the game, and you have a video filter area where if you have installed custom video filters, you can add them to the games or consoles the same way you've done the shaders earlier. And those are about all the important settings here, other than full screen and windowed full screen, which are pretty self-explanatory. Under the audio settings, we can mute the audio, we can adjust the volume per game or per console by saving it like we've shown you earlier, change the audio sync to be in line with the video that you're seeing, and if for some reason the audio is a slight delay before or after the actions you're performing on the screen, you can adjust the audio latency to compensate for this. Lower values will make the audio go sooner, higher values will make the audio appear later. Then we can change the audio device which is not recommended because this is controlled by Emulation Station, and the Audio DSP plugin, which is also going to be done outside of RetroArch. So those, again, are two settings you will not be using. For input, you can choose how many players can play simultaneously, up to 5. You can have unified menu controls. You can swap your OK and cancel buttons, which is also taken care of in Emulation Station. Set it so that your annoying nephew can't constantly change the menu settings by disabling all users' control menu. This makes it so only player 1 can control the menu. And then we have more settings that you're not going to be using. Then we have configuration, which only has one option. I recommend you leave it disabled. This is for people who easily forget to save, and though it can be useful in some instances, oftentimes you do not want to save the entire configuration every time you exit a game. So we usually leave this off. Under the saving section, you can choose to do automatic saving and automatic loading. The game will automatically save at intervals, and it will basically make a series of save states for you in case you forget to do it. This isn't really recommended because it can clutter up your console with unnecessary files, and it's a better idea to just save manually. For Save State Auto Index, if you turn this feature on, it's basically just going to order your save states for you. I recommend leaving this on, especially if you plan on using this configuration for a different console. Under Frame Throttle, we can control the very popular rewind and speed up features. You can also control slow motion. This allows you to rewind your game and to fast forward your game. In some instances where maybe people are just monologuing on far too long and you want to skip it, or if you need to undo a bad move that you've just done without necessarily loading from a save state, then you can go here to adjust those settings. User interface is really only used in standalone RetroArch applications, and therefore we're really not going to cover it here. You can safely ignore this menu without much change. The Achievements section allows you to enable achievements for a small selection of consoles. The applicable systems that you can use this for are Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo Entertainment System, Sega Mega Drive and Genesis, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, PC Engine, Master System, and Nintendo 64. Not all games are supported for every console, but many of them are. And basically, if you're familiar with Xbox or PlayStation systems, you're going to be very familiar with how achievements work. Basically, you earn an achievement whenever you can perform a certain task in the game, and it will actually register it on a server for you. You can set this up at http://retroachievements.org, and you can add your credentials for your username and password to the RetroArch configuration file found in the /opt/RetroPie or RetroEvolved/configs/all/RetroArch.cfg. Since this is more of an advanced task, we're not going to cover it in this tutorial, but you can look up a YouTube tutorial for how to enable achievements in RetroPie, and you will find the answers you're looking for. For network, these features will not be discussed in this tutorial because they are covered in NetPlay. You should not adjust the network settings inside RetroArch because you should be using the NetPlay feature in RetroEvolved or RetroPie instead. For playlists, this is also a feature that is only used inside standalone RetroArch. So again, you will not be using this. Same thing for user, and same thing for privacy. Under directory, you can change where files are stored, such as your filters, your shaders, your save files for each game, and your save states for each game. This can be useful if you decide you want to change your save states to be saved on the SD card rather than the hard drive, and it can be used for the same purpose for saving your games. Under the Information tab, we can find a small sample of information for our console, which will tell us what our IP address is, some information about the operating system, our database manager, which you will probably never use, and our cursor manager, which you will probably, again, never use. For configurations, if you decide to save your current configuration, please remember this will save all of the RetroArch settings that you just changed to the global RetroArch configuration file. And that's it. That's every single file in RetroArch.